So, Glenn, it's a huge pleasure to have you chatting with us today. And I want to just like jump in and to kind of your thinking, which is both radical and practical, a rare combination. And let me just start by saying one of the things that was kind of very interesting for me reading your book, Radical Markets, and looking at some of your videos is I think we share a concern about, declining productivity, about inequality, about the growing polarization in our economies and our politics. I think to some extent we share a diagnosis about concentration of power. What I loved most, though, and is that I think we share a passion for thinking beyond categories. And as the great philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn once said, he said, when you're facing extraordinarily new challenges, the biggest challenge of all is escaping your categorical thinking. And we've had plenty of that when we think about left versus right or markets versus firms. So thank you so much for really in your work for pushing us to get beyond a lot of those categories. Now let me try to sum up at least what I took away from the very core of your argument, and then ask you to kind of expand on this. Because here's what I took from your book. That your central argument is that prosperity depends very critically on our ability to combine and recombine resources, land, capital, talent, so that we get the best possible return on those. And that and we all know that's true. I mean, that's why the New York Stock Exchange outperforms every company on the New York Stock Exchange over time, because you have this allocational efficiency where it's very easy for people to divest and invest, and resources tend to flow to where people think they're going to get the best returns. But you're arguing there are all kinds of things in the economy that work against that kind of allocational efficiency, that work against ensuring that every unit of capital and talent is earning its best return, is being used in the best possible way. And one of the things that you argue stands in the way of that is property rights, and that in some sense everything needs to be for sale all the time, everywhere. I don't know if I've captured that, but that was the foundation. My head was starting to explode. So why don't you take a few minutes, unpack it, and tell us, like, is that what you're really saying? And give us an introduction to this idea.
Gary, I think I'd start with something even more basic, which is that standard economics is focused on a particular set of cases, which are called decreasing returns phenomena. These are ones where there's crowding, where eventually, when there's too many people involved in something, adding more to it, reduces its efficiency. And under circumstances like that, which really come back to Malthus and, limits to population growth, blah, blah, blah. This, standard market mechanisms that we focus on work well. And of course, that's an important set of circumstances. However, it's not the set of circumstances that lead to great wealth and prosperity and, dramatic improvements in standards of living. The things that lead to those are what you might call exponential technologies. Things that are self-reinforcing, compounding, that the more people get involved, the more opportunity they open up. Cities, the introduction of factories, networks. All of these are cases where we can gain most by network effects by having more people involved in the process. And there just is no argument that anyone's ever made with any success that you should expect institutions like standard capitalism to perform well in those circumstances. That's not what capitalism is optimized for. That's not what any of the theorems in economics say it should do. And the reason is pretty simple. The basic idea is that in capitalism, everyone's supposed to be paid for what they incrementally produce. Paid for their product. That's like the idea. And when you have diminishing returns, when more people are incrementally producing less, then if you pay everybody out that amount they're incrementally producing, you have some left over for the firm to take as profits. Whereas when you have increasing returns, that doesn't work. If you try to pay everyone out their incremental product, you pay out more than exists. So that whole logic of trying to just compensate everyone for what they're doing doesn't actually work. Now, the problem is that rather than trying to solve the big problem, which, the founders of modern economics, the people in the 19th century, they realized this when they sort of moved past Marxist, labor theory of value, whatever. They realized that there were these two different cases, they realized that the more important one was these increasing returns things. But they just didn't know what to do with it. They didn't have any answer to the question of how you allocate resources in that case. And so rather than saying, wow, there's this whole open field of exploration to figure out how the heck do we do that stuff, they instead said, let's focus on the case that we can solve and beat it 1,000 times into the ground, even though it's irrelevant. And really what I'm focused on doing is trying to open up that world and say, no, we can treat the way we organize ourselves the way that we treat technologies. They can be things that we just dramatically advance in. We're not even close to the Pareto frontier or whatever, to the best possible organization. We're just scratching the surface of humans' capacity to organize themselves at scale.
Yeah, I certainly believe that, but let me just tell you what I heard and then ask you a question. Clearly, what you see in cities are great examples, but what you're saying is where you see these exponential effects, I think two things are true. First of all, you have network effects or positive feedback effects. So, good becomes even better over time. The smartest people want to be around other smart people. They migrate to cities and cities do. So you increase the number of combinational possibilities and therefore the value of the network, number one. And number two, these are situations where you basically have zero variable costs. So by making more of something and sharing it, you don't reduce it for anybody else. There may have been a lot of fixed costs. Unfortunately, those conditions also tend to produce monopolies. Cities are monopolies. Cities monopolize talent for thousands of years. They pull talent out of the countryside and so on and impoverish the countryside. And of course, where you see this now with modern technology, whether it's Uber, whether it's Google, whether it's Facebook, or so on, you end up with these very powerful monopolies. So I understand those dynamics, and they present a lot of interesting challenges. It's interesting to me then that in your book, what you start with is what I would have regarded as the least, as the most sedentary, least exponential asset of all, which is land. So help me square that up.
Yeah, well, land is the original exponential asset because it's the foundation of the city, right? So Henry George tells a wonderful story, a parable of a savanna, where there's just an open savanna and you could settle anywhere. Everywhere's as good as everywhere else. It's all very nice places to farm. And a settler comes along and just randomly chooses some spot. But then once, that family has settled there, the next family says, well, where am I going to settle? I might as well settle next to this guy because at least then I'll have someone to talk to, someone to divide labor with, etc. And then the next people come and the next people and the next people. And then this guy who, he could have chosen anywhere. This family could have just, there was nothing to it. They just happened to be first. Ends up owning 10 square blocks of New York City or whatever, or of St. Louis. And through no effort of their own, they become incredibly wealthy. And not only do they become incredibly wealthy, but they can then stand in the way of development, of entrepreneurship, of the opportunity of the city to grow, to build infrastructure, etc. And so land is the original substrate for these types of, it's that sense of closeness. But of course, there are now other substrates for it as well. But I think, the city and the land in it is the original one.
So if we think about land as this, resource that is often not put to the best use, and you're saying, somebody could buy it and just sit on it and hoard it in a way. But you could also argue that maybe I bought that land in New York before it was New York. I had some sense it might become that one day. And I took this risk and I sat on that property for a long time. I could have deployed that capital elsewhere. It kind of makes it sound like uh, this is just a completely free ride for anybody who invests in something that's not immediately put to a best use. I was thinking about, I don't know, it's Ted Turner. Who are these people who own thousands and thousands of acres in Montana? And I'm so grateful they're keeping them open and pristine and whatever. But I was struggling with what would it mean to say, as I think is the argument in the book, what would it mean to say that anybody ought to be able to buy that property at any time, and develop it in some way? So I struggle with, I guess, those two things. Is it necessarily I'm a free rider if I took a risk, bought property, and haven't chosen to develop it yet? And the flip side of it is, if everything is forever for sale to the highest and best use as a way of increasing allocational efficiency, how do we as a society put some limits on how we want property to be used? So I'm sure you've heard those questions before. But let me throw them out.
No, they're great ones. So the first thing to note is that the speculative, like the notion that I knew that this was going to be big before anyone else, and don't I deserve some reward for that, is not actually, for example, in the case of land, an argument for why we'd want you to get any reward for having had that insight. Like, just being right about something without taking an action on the basis of that actually helps the good thing come into existence is not very useful, right? So, like, take the example of the land. If you just buy up that land, yeah, you might have known before anyone else that it was going to go up in value. At some level, who cares? Like, why is it relevant that you bought that land relative? I mean, now, if you build something that's useful to whatever, that has some relevance, right? But just being smarter than anyone else is just a macho contest. It's not actually something that generates value.
So you're trying to dissuade kind of sheer luck, or maybe even a certain amount of foresight, in favor of somebody who's doing something productive to increase the value of that asset.
In the blockchain world, there's a little cute name for this. So there was some like Twitter exchange where someone said, I don't care if you guys are selling, I'm HODLing, I'm hodling. He just misspelled it. So he meant to say I'm holding. But then it became this thing that everyone said, I'm hodling, right? But people in the Bitcoin, in the Ethereum community responded, no, I'm biddling. So like the thing that matters is building, not holding, right? And we should reward building. We shouldn't reward speculation. Now, though it may be impossible to separate those, that's a question. Can we separate those? And that's what we try to do in some of this work, is find ways to separate those. But as a matter of principle, we as a society should reward building, not holding.
Yeah, I do think that makes sense. Now, help me take that idea farther. So, if you move from land, and by the way, this idea has been around for a long time. I think people have struggled to put it into effect and do it at scale. And maybe you want to comment on that a little bit. I'm sure there's some political things behind it, because the argument is that every piece of land I should be paying kind of the value of my plot of ground, every year in taxes. And if I put improvements on it, well, then I can keep the value of those improvements. But in a way, I shouldn't be able to extract any value just for the value of the land as it is. How does that, first of all, has that been done at scale anywhere? And then I would say, how do you take that idea and move it beyond land?
Yeah. So a couple things about that. First of all, it's important to say, and we'll get to this in the part of moving beyond land, that the land tax idea itself has become a real focus for people, a real obsession. But it has some real limitations. Like, it's the beginning of an interesting conversation, but it's not, as it's often treated, some sort of religious solution to everything. Second, it has been implemented. It's been implemented at scale, and it's been implemented at scale in the places in the world that I think have been the most successful of anywhere in the world in A, promoting economic prosperity, B, achieving political comedy across usual dividing lines, and C, in adapting to some of the challenges we faced in recent years more effectively than anywhere else. So the three most impressive examples are Singapore, Taiwan, and Estonia.
So maybe
Um,
start with Taiwan if you don't mind,
yeah.
because I was really taken by that example in the story. So yeah, that would be good to go deeper there.
So Taiwan was, modern Taiwan was founded by the retreating armies of the nationalist Chinese, who had represented the original Chinese Revolution in, during the First World War type period, which was founded by Sun Yat-sen. And Sun Yat-sen was the father of Chinese nationalism, but he was a follower of Henry George. Like, he looked to George the way that Mao looked to Marx, and as such, written into Taiwanese constitution is the notion that the land belongs to the people in common, and that taxes should be arranged so as to extract the value of the land for the public. And that's been a core part of development in Taiwan and the dynamism that's allowed so much entrepreneurship and so much growth in Taiwan.
Can you just say a moment about how that actually works in practice, Glenn?
Well, in Taiwan, you have to self-assess the value of your property, and you pay a tax on that self-assessed value, and the government can take the property from you at that self-assessed value at any time. So if you price it too low, the government has the right to buy it out from you.
And how often does that happen? And when it does happen, what does the government do with it?
Not frequently enough, and that's one reason why in the book we advocate an even more aggressive system where private individuals can also engage in takings.
And
But
so what, as you see it, or as Henry George envisioned it, what is the benefit of that?
Well, I think in Singapore you see it even more fully executed, which is that they have a similar sort of a system, but the takings are much more frequent. And the government I think the land turnover rate through some form of eminent domain there is like once every 5 years for an average lot or something like that. And that's allowed the city to be incredibly dynamic, because as new enterprises come in, as new possible uses for parts of the city come in, it's constantly possible for them to recycle land that was best suited to one use during one technological stage to another use in another technological stage.
And I know in your book, and we're not going to do it justice in our conversation in here. In your book, you have quite a deep and quite a subtle argument about how you balance the need for somebody to have enough confidence that they're going to invest in this piece of land and make it better. But at the same time, if at some point that land is no longer being put to its best use, somebody can buy it and repurpose it. And there's a tension there, obviously, that you talk about, in the book. Let's go though beyond land for a moment, because I'm thinking today, and it's hardly a new insight.
Gary, before we go in there, let me just make one comment, which is to say,
please.
I think there's a subtlety that's also not reflected in the book that even applies to land, which is that in the book it was very much like anyone can buy it, the money goes to some undefined global revenue pool. And I think one of the biggest things that's missed going beyond the land issue is that really that's just the start of the conversation, because the usual argument is, well, land doesn't, it doesn't belong to land. It's, the city, like it's all the stuff that's created by people in the city. But then you say, well, actually, most of the value of New York City comes from the fact that it's the main city in the United States. So should the money go to the city of New York? Should it go to the state of New York? Should it go to the United States in general? Should it go to the world because it's the center of global you think of Singapore, it's like everyone's like, Singapore's so great. Well, it's true, but it's like also on the Strait of Malacca, which is the choke point for global commerce, especially between the US and China. And it's like, if the whole US-China thing had never happened, there's no way Singapore would be in the position that it's in, right? So you see what I mean? Like, the whole perspective is, it's really just the start of a conversation of where that value actually accrues. It's just noting that that's a case where it's particularly clear that it doesn't mostly accrue to the individual owner, but it doesn't actually say positively where it does accrue. And once you realize that actually land is really just reductio ad absurdum, illustrating a broader point, rather than actually being the thing itself. You know what I mean?
So let's not get let's leave land behind then for a moment, not get hung up there. Although it is a very interesting, and I urge anyone that's interested, like dive into the book, understand this, read a bit of Henry George. It's important to understand the thing behind this. But obviously today, Glenn, in our world, most of the value of property is are not real assets. It's algorithms, it's brands, it's intellectual property, it's patents, and so on. So, how would you and of course we see these powerful monopolies that kind of, have deep patent reservoirs, have all these customer relationships, have all the stickiness of the social media connections, have all the network effects. How do you think about, how does your idea of radical market start to apply where the asset is not capital but something else?
Well, first of all, there's quite a few. So first of all, it's important to understand that despite all the immateriality of our modern economy, land is still a very, very large chunk of all value. And actually, it hasn't substantially declined in recent years. We've seen a huge run up in land value. So there's constant predictions that we're going to like dematerialize into cyberspace and people will be scattered around everywhere. And yet more and more opportunity, maybe until the pandemic, maybe the pandemic will change it, but more and more opportunity has actually been concentrated in a few places with very problematic land policy. So I wouldn't discount the land issue on its own. But in many ways, I focus much more on the other issues. That's why I'm in a tech company. That's why I'm very much in the blockchain space. And there's a whole range of types of digital and intellectual assets to which the ideas can directly be applied. They can be directly used for intellectual property. They can be directly used for spectrum, which is another land-like right, but which is very relevant in the digital space. They can directly be used for cloud instances, which is another important asset at the moment. But then you start to get into domains where their relevance is more complex. So you think about something like data. I don't think these ideas in particular are directly relevant to data, and the reason is that data are naturally properties of social interactions rather than of a piece of property or something like some asset. Like my mother's date of birth is also my mother's date of birth. So that data is a property of how we stand in relationship to each other. It's not a property of some external object, right? And governance there, just as in this other case, depends on recognizing sort of the fundamentally social nature of the value creation. But it needs to sort of be baked into the, governance of the use of it rather than just how the value accrues and how one's able to take the asset or something like that.
So then, I mean, I know one of your recommendations, and it's something that I raised, I don't know, a decade ago, when it first became clear that our data was being used to create economic value. And I wondered, like, why there wasn't an intermediary that would hold our data in some kind of a vault and we could monetize it and sell it and so on. But of course, by the time I had that insight, Google is 10 years old and like there's no way back. So, one of the things that you kind of point out in the book is how concentrated power is in most of these industries. And indeed, you could argue that the goal of every capitalist is to create a monopoly. And whether that was, oil or railroads or automobiles or telecommunications or social media or software and often, capitalists have been very good at doing that. And then the government sets in. So is there anything, and now we have probably more industrial concentration than we've had in 100 years, immensely powerful corporations with enormous political influence. So what in your proposals, Glenn, would help us kind of deal with that and kind of resist? Because what I sense in your writing, and I would agree with, is this kind of strong decentralist ideology that, centralized power and decision making, central planning is often not good, crony capitalism is not good. What in the way you think about radical markets might help to unwind that at a macro level and then maybe we can dive inside individual organizations and think about the application there. But I'm thinking right now at the macro level, where we have more concentrated power than we've had in a century, are there some ideas here that might give us a new way of thinking about how to deal with that?
Well, fundamentally, I think that the understanding of the last several hundred years and what's led to progress in, our political economic system is missing some really, really important elements. What really happened is not, quote, the unleashing of capitalism in the Manchesterian, rugged individualist sense of capitalism. Instead, what has actually happened is to the extent that we've succeeded, is a continuous process of encouraging, through often multi-sectoral efforts involving universities, governments, and business, the creation of new places for us to interact, new ways for us to have economic systems. And then often those are, because of the capitalist features of the system, monopolized. But then there's usually some, again, multi-sectoral process of turning those monopolies into things that are democratically accountable to the participants. And only then is the value coming from that able to actually spread and lead to widespread growth. So you see that with really the birth of industrialism. Where does it come from? Well, you've got people leaving the countryside, coming into cities. And initially those cities are, more or less some kind of feudal fiefdom of some lord. But that doesn't really work well, because the lord then extracts all the rents and, stagnates progress and whatever. So then the cities become republics, that are governed by their members. And then they're able to grow, and then they're able to provide sewage and blah, blah, blah. And so then you have now the emergence of like factories. And initially these factories are just, pure capitalist enterprises. But pretty quickly you realize, well, then the capitalist treats everyone like a machine. People aren't actually able to be creative. They aren't able to have agency. They aren't able to advance in their careers. They're kind of like slaves. And that's actually not productive, right? And so then labor unions emerge to allow for that input, for that creative response that actually makes those sites of real, industrial progress. And you've got similar things that happen with utilities and with et cetera, et cetera. So I think that we've sort of told ourselves the wrong story about the past. And as such, we see the path to the future incorrectly as well. It is in the nature of, simplistic capitalism to lead to these types of hierarchical monopolies, which are actually themselves opposed to the spirit that capitalism imagines itself as having. And it's only by constantly having these other forces play a role in bringing about and emerging new forms of sort of democratization that we actually allow markets to thrive within the system that throws up these monopolies. And, the internet's the perfect example of this. Everyone thinks of the internet as oh my gosh, the internet allows, the world to be flat and capital, blah, 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 and John Perry Barlow, anarchism, blah, blah, blah. But actually, the internet only emerged from a concerted set of efforts by governments, universities, and businesses to sort of overcome their differences and create an even playing field, which allowed for that kind of decentralization, even if for just a very short period of time, to emerge. And it's by forgetting those origin stories, forgetting the active democratic engagement that it takes to create decentralization, that we constantly allow decentralizing technologies to fall into centralization again.
Yeah, and I think you're right. We end up, and I have to tell you, economists have some responsibility because they love dividing the world into highly simplistic categories and pretending that's reality. But we have tended to do that. I mean, I hear people talk about free markets as if there's some kind of free market fundamentalism. Well, I don't actually know many economists who would believe that, right? I mean, markets work when they have structure around them and regulation around them, and and so we have this indictment now of capitalism, because it's been poorly managed, because we've let it escape kind of the boundaries that we need to put around it. It's a little bit like when you're a parent raising a kid. The natural state of human beings is selfishness, right? You see it in every 2-year-old, and parents spend the first 18 years trying to help their kids be other-centered and learn how to channel that selfishness. It's not like you just like grow up wild like a flower. And so we kind of profess like shock when capitalism, absent any kind of constraints, amplifies the worst of human tendencies. And then we say, well, the problem is capitalism. But to me, that's a little bit like blaming sex for STDs, porno addiction, and unwanted pregnancies. I mean, the solution is not celibacy. Probably the solution is like, how do you treat sex in some kind of responsible way? So I'd be interested, and then I want to turn it over to Michele. Like, how did we let this thing get so out of balance, right? Because you're saying, if you go back and look at the origin story of the internet and so on, we did have rules around it. We had boundaries around it. But for some reason, we're now in a place where there are millions of people who believe the system no longer works for them, and that those boundaries are no longer effective in the right way.
Well, I think boundaries and constraints isn't quite the right way to think about it. And I, in fact, think that language traps us, because what we actually need is an acceleration of progress in governance to match the acceleration in progress of technology. Albert Einstein once said that if the organizing power of man had advanced as much as his tools had, that we would all have easy and carefree lives. But that as it is, we've put razor blades in the hands of 3-year-old children. And I think that that's fundamentally the problem. The problem is not that we don't have enough constraints on the process, but that we don't have enough progress in our ability to identify the challenges that stand in the way of further development, including the potential destructive effects that development can have without being channeled correctly and overcome them.
One quick question then, because I know you've written about this, because I 100% agree. Particularly with technology, what you have is the pace of evolution in technology is so much faster than the pace of evolution in how we govern, how we create public policy, how we come to agreement on things, which is why we're always trying to close, the barn door after the whole horse is bolted. And Europe years later, says, let's do something about data privacy, and we're kind of behind that in the United States. So what would be your idea about how we accelerate, as you said, the kind of public policy priority shaping apparatus so that it can somehow keep up with the pace at which technology is changing our lives and will continue to change our lives?
Well, I think that if you think about what democracy is, I think that there's fundamentally 3 elements, and none of them we've really figured out a good way to scale. One is compromise, the ability of different people, many people, to come together, give up on the things that are less important to them, and get the things that are most important to them. Deliberation, the ability of people to have a conversation at scale, to understand all the issues that other people are working with, and to try to identify solutions that are out of the box and that honor everyone's values better than the things coming in. And pluralism, the notion that even in spite of that, we're going to disagree with each other. There's going to be differences among us. And those are not things to be, those are not problems. They're actually sources of energy and strength for us that we can harness to find good things in the future, and that we should actually acknowledge and celebrate even as we try to work across them. And I don't think we've been good at scaling any of those things. So let me give you illustration. So how do we make compromises at scale? We only do it through hierarchies. We elect people to do the same thing that we would do if we were in a New England town hall meeting with each other. We haven't actually found a way, other than just pushing it off to someone else, to engage with each other at scale. So we can't really deliberate at scale. We haven't figured out how to do compromise at scale. We know that standard voting, all it does is let the majority rule. But the majority ruling is not compromise. The majority ruling is the opposite of compromise. It's just giving one side victory, right? And we haven't figured out how to do pluralism. We have this idea that there are states and that, we represent the states and we have federalism by states. But like, states are not the main divide in our society these days. We have divides over race. We have divides over location. And we don't have any representation of those things and federalism by those things. So we haven't figured out how to do any of those things. But, we now have solutions to those problems.
Yeah, but you have a few thoughts on how to do that. So maybe give us a thought or two, and let's maybe, Taiwan, I think, is again one of the examples you use of where they're using technology, have a more open deliberative process to hear more voices. Take us through an idea you have of how do you scale that up in a way that clearly is not happening right now in democracy.
Well, I'll give you a quick example of each of these. So on the case of deliberation, one of the amazing things that natural language processing allows us to do is to take a large number of statements and summarize them down to a small number of statements that are digestible. And what they've done in Taiwan is use that to facilitate deliberation at scale. And that might sound magical, but that's what happens on Wikipedia every day. People work together and they actually produce relatively concise, readable outputs that are part of a collective deliberation. And in Taiwan, they've used that to solve issues from gay marriage to the regulation of ride-sharing platforms in ways that have made them the most successful society in the world, I think, at addressing everything from misinformation to climate change to COVID-19.
Can you give us the mechanics of that just on a particular issue, Glenn, so we understand how it works?
The notion is that everyone, puts in a statement about what they think about an issue. And then those statements get sort of clustered and filtered and grouped. And then synthetically out of that come a small number of things that everyone can read. Without any hierarchical, without anyone, this person's the representative of this, it just comes out of the natural language processing. And then everyone has the opportunity to offer new statements that try to synthesize or get past the divisions that were clear from the first cluster. And you attract support from the ability to get people supporting what you're saying that were across the initial divisions. And then again, it's summarized by NLP. And you see, so you can actually have a thoughtful democratic conversation at scale using these tools.
So sophisticated sentiment analysis. And okay, so that was case one, right? So how do you extract the point of views, right?
How do we do compromise at scale? Again, something they're doing in Taiwan. The notion is that everyone can be allocated a budget of credits to vote on issues or on statements, but that the more credits that you put on a given issue, the more expensive it becomes to put more on that issue. So that you're forced to temper your extreme feelings, even as you're able to express them. So that's what creates this sense of compromise.
When you say it costs more, do I get a particular number of credits? And,
yeah. Let's say you get 100
if I use
credits.
one on one issue to have the same impact on the next issue, I have to give more? How does this work?
On that issue, so you can have impact on another issue for just as cheap, but if you want to have more impact on one issue, if you want to be more extreme, then it becomes increasingly expensive. Yeah.
So an escalating curve there. All right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Very interesting.
So that's called quadratic voting, and that's a way of doing compromise at scale. And then pluralism at scale, I think fundamentally is what social networks can allow us to do. Because the thing is, when they set up the U.S. Constitution, they set up the states or whatever. But like that's very static. That's a snapshot of like what might have been the issues and the divisions in a society at one moment. But social networks give us a dynamic sense of what the divisions are. And so far we've used social networks to trap people in filter bubbles and so forth. But we could have the opposite approach. We could actually encourage, what does the Senate do? It has equal representation of the states, which forces people from different states to cooperate, even if one state could otherwise dominate, right? What if we had rules like that within the social media world? What if in order to do things, you had to find people who are social network distant from each other? That would lead to a basically different architecture. It would lead to one that actually generated pluralism, that celebrated these different groups, but also encouraged them to cooperate across each other.
Glenn, one of the things I love all three of those examples. Thank you for sharing that. One of the things I felt for a long time is that, in fact, if you go back and you look at long history, you find this to be true, that technology, let me say it differently, organizational innovation, because what you're talking about, the technology to do this has been there for a while. You're talking about applying it in a different way. And what you find is that organizational innovation often lags technology innovation by decades, by generations, sometimes centuries, because the organizational habits and patterns, the political habits and patterns are very, very deeply set. And it seems to me that's kind of where we are now. Even if I look at how companies are using technology, right? We're using things like Slack and Microsoft Teams to bring more efficiency to white collar work, right? Share documents, set up schedules. We're not thinking about these technologies to fundamentally change the way like who has decision rights, how do you allocate resources, who gets to set strategy, and so on. And I think so. As you think about this, you look at you talk about Taiwan. It's more or less monoculture. 20 million people, 25 million people. It's not a huge country. Talk us a little bit through how we go from here to there, and let's stay in the sphere we're talking about now, more democracy, public policy. We'll have another conversation and go deep into the corporate world. But what is the hope of organizing to make this happen when you have so much invested in the existing model, right? It's not that these new models are so difficult to get your head around or impossible to think about, but it's sure hard to build a coalition that will actually do it.
Well, I think that Taiwan's a great example because while it's very easy to think like, Asians, monocultural, they all just get along with each other. The reality is that Taiwan has a lot of the same types of ethno-cultural / political divisions that beset the United States. There are actually several different ethnic groups there that represent different waves of migration to Taiwan. And those line up with both economic and with political divisions in the country. And the moment that really sort of got past those divisions was a moment of conflict with mainland China, which came in 2014 when there was a trade deal that was going to be passed that would have allowed the Chinese tech stack to sort of pervade Taiwan. And there was a protest movement that actually occupied the national legislature, not so different from our January 6th moment. But using some of these tools for consensus, deliberation, and pluralism at scale, they were able to channel that moment rather than to be one of division into one of unity that was actually accepted by the government, to the point where the government appointed members of that protest movement as reverse mentors to its own ministers. And then the new government came into power and brought those people in as the actual ministers. And I think that it's often in these moments of threat where we see our values, where we see that they can't continue the way that they've continued, that we have a chance at real change. And I think the Taiwan story is actually directly relevant to us on those lines because, the story of what's going on in Taiwan is one of the few things that I think could really unite people in, say, the United States around this type of innovation. Because everyone's afraid of the PRC. And at the same time, the digital minister who did this is one of the first transgender political leaders in the world. So it really brings together the concerns of the right and the left and the focus on democracy, et cetera. So I think there's a real chance that story can light the way for many others, and that it's not quite as exceptional as it sounds.
As we might first think. Well, I love that story, Glenn. And there are a couple of things I take away from that. First of all, you do need a kind of existential threat in a way. And if you're paying attention to politics right now in our country, like it seems we're, I don't want to say it's existential, but we're kind of at each other's throats, more polarization. So if there's a time to try something different, now would probably be it. The other thing, and maybe you could go deeper on this in the story for a moment, because as I understand it, what happened in Taiwan is they launched this new kind of deliberative process in parallel with the existing political process. It wasn't like we're just going to, throw one thing out and try something else. they were using this to debate issues, to bring thoughts together. Existing agencies and ministries could then bring the most popular or the ones that had a lot of support into the formal political process. But this was a kind of parallel set of experimentation, just like an open source. Somebody can fork the code, you can try something else. So am I misrepresenting it? How do they manage kind of the risk of allowing this new thing to gain credibility, for people to have confidence in this, without kind of blowing up what was already there?
So one of my favorite thinkers, Hannah Arendt, has a wonderful book called On Revolution.
I've read it.
In which she distinguishes between the American and the French revolutions. And she says that, the thing about the American Revolution is that they established legitimacy before authority. Whereas in the French Revolution, they established authority before legitimacy. In the American Revolution, there were practices of local democracy built up over long periods of time, and people saw them working better than was, the rule from Britain. And so then they said, let's throw off the rule from Britain and empower the thing that's working, right? Whereas in France, they said, we don't like this. We're just going to lop off the head and let's see what we can put in its place, right? And Audrey, the digital minister of Taiwan, calls herself a conservative anarchist, which is that she believes in allowing these different possibilities to emerge, but through their legitimacy on the terms of the existing system, not through some sort of violent upheaval. And I think that's the way that real lasting valuable change takes place.
Yeah, I mean, that brings kind of full circle to where we started about kind of, getting beyond categorical thinking, because, I've had this thought, Glenn. I mean, as most of all a pragmatist, watching left and right kind of demonize and destroy each other is deeply disconcerting, because I believe there's truth in both. I mean, a conservative would say, embedded in our institutional arrangements, organized religion, family, constitutional government, whatever those things are, school systems, embedded in that is a lot of hard-won wisdom around how you order society in ways that are effective. Having said that, it's easy for conservatives to venerate the past and fall in love with it and try to preserve things that are not working anymore or very unequal. Progressives on the other hand, kind of, I think, often have this utopian view about the perfectibility of human beings, but are driven by a genuine things need to be better. These inequities cannot stand. But if conservatives venerate the past, I think sometimes the progressives vandalize the past. But there hasn't been, and it seems to me there's a lot of people who profit in some ways of keeping us at each other's throats. What you're describing here, what Taiwan has done, is a way of creating a new commons where these things can be debated and addressed in subtle ways with both viewpoints represented, rather than having us behind the barricades, throwing metaphorical or real bricks at each other.
Well, I think it's even beyond that. I think that, to me, the essence of pluralism is to say that not only do we need to transcend these divides, that's not actually the point, but that these divides are actually sources of strength. That's actually how we get to good solutions, is by dealing with these different perspectives. Because I think one of the deepest truths in conservatism is pluralism. I think conservatism believes profoundly that no, it's not just the state, it's not just the this or that, it's all of the complexity that is built up over that time that's valuable. And I think that's absolutely right. And I think progressivism says, no, it's not static. It's not like, so societies are dynamic. And I think that's profoundly correct as well. And that it's really at the synthesis between them, which we haven't been able to achieve, that we have the possibility of something different. It's like in seeing the complex but dynamic system that is the world, that we actually have the chance for both the most rapid progress and the deepest pluralism.
So your recommendation, if I'm understanding it, and again, we haven't done justice to this today. Please, read the book Radical Markets. Dig into. We'll put up links. Dig into Glen's thinking. It's very, very useful. but is your way forward, as you think about the example of Taiwan and using technology to kind of, have this deliberative democracy in a different kind of way? Is the starting point that we should be trying this at the level of cities or counties or local government, and we see what works and scale it up, or what's your vision of the way forward here?
I don't think pluralism only happens in levels of government or something like that. I think that's one way to do it. But I think it also happens in different civic organizations, in corporations, in all sorts of different things that are subsidiary to the imagined totality. But even the nation state is not the totality. The world is the totality. So there's all different levels. And it's because of the pluralism of the world as it actually exists that there's a chance for these sorts of things to emerge. You can start from anywhere, and at any level in experimenting with these types of things.
Yeah, well, that's certainly our view as well. That complex, deeply entrenched systems do not start with some big grand redesign from the top. It starts with experimentation and people willing to try things. Glen, we've left a lot, that we wanted to cover today, and we've run out of time. I'm hoping you'll be able to come back and we can dig into how all of this applies for how large corporations are run, how large organizations, institutions, public and private, are run, which are, as we would argue, often inertial, often incremental, in many ways inhuman, and we need a revolution and how they're organized as much as anything else. And thank you for pointing us back again to this possibility, this need to be deeply imaginative about how the way we organize human beings together. So deep thank you for those thoughts. We'll provide the links, and we hope we're going to have the chance to talk to you again and go deeper.
Looking forward to it, Gary. Really fun conversation.
I hope you're enjoying the conversation. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank Hire for underwriting the costs of producing this interview. Hire is the world's leading appliance company and also a global leader in the Internet of Things. For the last decade, Hire has been leading a remarkable revolution in management. It is proven that even the largest, most complex organizations in the world can be entrepreneurial at their core. Now, back to our conversation.
Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to the New Human Movement. Today, Gary and I are continuing our conversation with Glen Weyl, who is the Microsoft's Office of the Chief Technology Officer, political economist, and social technologist. I think I got that right. Octopest, which is, I think, the coolest corporate acronym out there by a mile. So kudos on that, Glen. And in that role, Glen advises the company, Microsoft, on the future of technology in relationship to political and economic change, and he manages a research group focused on fostering a vision of technology that supports collaboration rather than centralization and automation. And Glen is the co-author of a very influential book he wrote with Eric Posner in 2018 called Radical Markets. And the book has inspired a social movement called RadicalxChange that convenes people of all kinds, art activists, artists, entrepreneurs, and researchers who are all keen on using information technology and market mechanisms to create a more rich and more equal society. So, Glen, welcome back to the New Human Movement. Thanks for making the time to talk to us again.
It's an honor to be with you guys, and thanks for the kind introduction.
Well, let's get going. And Glen, maybe we can talk a little bit about the kinds of problems you and other folks at the RadicalxChange are really passionate on solving. And if I remember the premise or the mission statement of RadicalxChange, it's to, quote, modernize and innovate the basic institutions of democracy and markets. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Unpack the premise. What does modernizing mean, right, in this context? And why is this a pressing problem?
So Albert Einstein once said that if the organizing power of man had kept pace with his tools and weapons, that we would all have carefree and happy lives. But that as it is, we've put razor blades in the hands of 3-year-old children. And I really think of that as kind of an epigraph for all the work I do. I think we need to accelerate the pace of innovation and governance to match the pace of change of the tools that connect us. We need ways to extend to a global scale with millions of people the type of richness that we have in, small communities and groups that are smaller than the Dunbar number, et cetera. And that, to me, is really what stands before us. And I think if we don't solve that problem, if we don't manage to accelerate our social technologies to keep pace with our physical technologies will destroy us. It won't just slow our growth. Will actually, destroy all that we have. You can think of global warming as just an example of one of the many things that happens when we're not able to adapt the pace of governance to keep up with the pace of what technology does.
Certainly, can I just say there? I mean, certainly that's been a problem as humanity that we've been struggling with for some time. If I recall, the League of Nations came out of World War I and this desire to avoid another, mass conflagration, which of course it didn't. You have things like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that are, trying to cope with the spread of nuclear weapons around the world. So it does seem like we're in this constant running catch-up battle with our tools keep getting better, but I'm wondering, it's not only that our institutions don't change as fast. I'm not sure that our moral inclinations are changing as fast as we're becoming more powerful, can change our environment, can kill each other in like these immense ways, and yet our institutions and maybe even our ethics is not keeping. Is that kind of the essence of your argument here?
Yeah, I'm not sure our ethics are the primary thing that needs to change, at least on its own. If you think of the evolution of the human body, the underlying cells in the human body did change. But primarily, what creates complex life is the adaptation of the ways in which those cells interact with each other. And those collective institutions and their dynamism is really what offers opportunities, even for moral change, because the reality is most morality comes from our affiliations with social groups and our relationships to each other, rather than just our internal state. So I think that problem of social organization is at the core of the challenges that face us, whether they're in the form of productivity or in the form of politics.
So Glenn, can you maybe say a little bit more about the lack of progress in kind of social innovation, institutional innovation? Where did things start to stagnate and why?
Well, first of all, I think things have in some sense been stagnating for a very, very long time. There's a wonderful book by David Graeber and David Wengrow that came out in the fall, which really talks about how if you look over the long sweep of human history, much more than we thought, there was huge amounts of social innovation and organizational innovation in the history of societies. And that has sort of gotten progressively ossified. And I think that part of the reason that that's the case is that adapting social organizations to match technologies has been really challenging. And social organizations usually adapt quite slowly. They may be much more robust. They may be much more functional if they adapt over those long periods of time. But with technology moving so fast, it's been hard to help them keep pace. We haven't had a science of social design and social reimagination to match the science of physical technologies. I think we can get there, but I think it's been missing. And I think as a result, we've just had slow and not very imaginative change in our social institutions. And we've gotten even worse, I think, since the 1970s. I think this whole neoliberal thing really froze us because it said, oh, there's just this very simplistic imagination of capitalism that will do it all. And that stopped us from having to actually think about what could be more ambitious ways of organizing society.
A practical example of that, I think, Glenn, let me test this and see if this is the kind of, because if I understand it, your premise is that our social organizations are changing much slower than our tools, than our technologies. And one wonderful example of that in a book on military innovation talked about when muskets got introduced to European warfare. And before that, battle formations had many ranks because the archers shot over the heads of the archers in front of you. The arrows, were on that kind of trajectory. And they went back and looked at how long it took for those military formations to change so they were long and thin and better suited to rifles, to muskets. And it took almost 100 years. And their argument was that the limitation was, several generations of generals had to die out before you could really optimize the organization for this new tool and this new weapon. And is that part of the argument, that somehow the pace of organizational evolution is just so much slower than the pace of technological evolution?
Well, yeah, so I think you just gave a great example, Gary. Like, think about the phalanx, right? The phalanx is, a form of organization that evolved over a very long time in ancient Greece, and didn't actually require a lot of central organization. Like, so you can basically do a phalanx with basically local principles of adjacency and things like this. And so it was possible to sort of have a kind of very democratic horizontal system that was aligned with the phalanx. Now, you could have, over a very long period of time, evolved something like that worked for muskets, right? But it probably would have been quite a slow process of sort of feeling around and working with that. But technology was advancing. You needed to try to keep up with that. And so the only way to do it ended up being like, Napoleon comes in and orders everybody to reorganize, and you get levy en masse and, this whole new way that's adapted to these new technologies. But the question is, can we come up with a way to innovate those social forms more quickly? If we can, we don't have to either rely on some general ordering us to do it or on this incredibly slow process of social change. We can actually have a process of social change that's adapted to the speed of those new tools. And that, I think, is way more powerful than either sort of a centralizing approach that sort of gives up on that power and robustness of the human intelligence, or one that's just sort of stuck in these stagnant forms that aren't adapted to our new technological organizations.
Let me throw out two thoughts there quickly. One is, I think there's a reason some people are suspicious of large wholesale social reorganization. We've tried that a few times in history, and it usually doesn't work well. We have some utopian view, and that was, the Nazis, and that was communism, and so on, and and that was Mao's, Cultural Revolution. And usually those attempts to radically, massively reorganize society end up, producing kind of dangerous tyrannies. So maybe we can come back to that. That's like, there's a reason people may be skeptical about anybody's idea to let's quickly and comprehensively reorganize society. But the other thing I wanted, just to come back to your point, we see this in much more prosaic ways in the organizations we work with. So if you think of collaborative technology, it seems to me the way most companies are using that today, they have Slack, and they have, your teams can talk to each other. They have Microsoft Teams. Basically, we're using those technologies to do for the productivity of white collar teams what Microsoft Office did 30 years ago to individuals, right? So we'll connect people, and they can share some ideas. They can, schedule calendars. They can share documents. They can have meetings. Very few companies have used this technology, for example, to crowdsource strategy, to go to the whole organization and say, what's your point of view about who we should become? And it seems that the real sticking point maybe here in social evolution is not that we don't have new ideas, not that people don't have ideas about how we change our organizations, but you have a very deeply entrenched power structure who's not necessarily that interested in decentralizing, in democratizing, in giving up their prerogatives, and that may be the break on this. So, one, there may be a reason people are a little suspicious of this, and number two, if this isn't happening, how do you deal with the entrenched power structures that are quite comfortable with, the way society works right now? And is the only way to change them is something that ends up being kind of a revolution and fairly bloody.
So first of all, I think it depends a lot on what type of social change you're thinking of, and in fact, whether it's the right direction or not. So I think the right direction of social change is profoundly pluralistic. It's not totalizing. It doesn't have a single view. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It views the diversity and sort of emergence of human organizations as precisely the things that need to be optimized for. And that vision, unlike some of these others, naturally has allied to it a theory of change that's very multi-scale. It can start very local. It can start very large. It can start in between, and that's probably its perfect spot, right? And because it doesn't think that, oh, there's one system. It thinks there's many systems and many layers, and wherever you start, you can make that organization more productive by using these things. And that helps get around a lot of the problems that you were just describing, Gary, because you don't have to stop at the top of the organization and have a single point of bottleneck. You can start wherever there's a creative person who wants to experiment with things, and practices can spread from there based on the efficacy of the organization that's created that way.
But Glenn, you mentioned the fact that there's a paucity of vision, or we don't really have many alternatives. But at least when it comes to organization, at the level of like an individual firm or nonprofit, doesn't have to be a for-profit enterprise. Ideas about lateral, flat, lateral, community-driven, networked organization has been around for 50, 60 years. There were bold visions of technology-driven decentralization and peer production and so on, advanced by Eric Raymond and a lot of other people in the early 90s, right, who were already foreseeing what technology would allow us to do. And every generation seems to kind of discover these truths. And then, but I'm not sure that they're acting upon them. So, going back to, I want to press you maybe a little bit more on what Gary was saying. Is it that we don't really know what some of these answers are? Is it that the tools themselves have so far proved rudimentary and therefore they're not very practical? Or is it that, like, the people at the top of the pyramid, given the fact that all these ideas are profoundly countercultural and anti-authoritarian, are just able to co-opt them, to marginalize them, or in a way to hijack them and make them tools of centralization and in greater authority?
I do think there are fundamental limitations to the things that have been developed so far. They're not like these. Almost none of the things that you're describing actually have the same relationship to social science theory that the technologies that we use have to computer science theory, or the physical tools we have to physics. They're not actually, in any sense, optimized or derived from and sort of formal systems that allow some sort of scalable, reproducible, like that's not what they have been. They've been interesting thinking and experiments from a much more bottom-up perspective, or at best, they've been sort of people who are not sort of really like social science, quantitative, thinkers trying to feel around these spaces. They've been great. I love their work. It's been a great inspiration, but it's not the sort of thing that like you could run on a blockchain or whatever. It's like, it's more some set of practices that all sorts of people have to learn huge amounts about and invest in order to, and sort of get indoctrinated, whatever. They're not these just, it's not like a game that you can play or a algorithm that you can run. And I think we need things that have that value set. And I think there's also some things sort of a little bit missing from the way that those values are constructed philosophically, but that we can talk about. But overall, I think they're in the right place. But then you need to actually say, like, okay, if the market is the optimal mechanism in this very particular set of circumstances that don't really correspond to the world that we live in, what are closer to optimal mechanisms for the actual situations that we live in? And that just hasn't. There's nothing like that really out there.
Can I just jump in? I think that's true, but I also throw out a caveat, or let me start with the caveat. I mean, clearly, social innovation is way more difficult than technical innovation. First of all, you got, bits and atoms don't ask you whether you want to experiment on them. They, like, you just, you write code, you try things. If you want to do social experimentation, you have to have the permission of your subjects. And there are a lot of ethical issues involved in doing that. So certainly, just technically, it's not as simple. And you have a lot of people today doing behavioral science research, but they're doing it, in laboratories with willing subjects, and they're not often experimenting with more complex social systems, which just is like an order of magnitude, I would argue, more difficult to do than writing code. Having said that, Glenn, where it seems to me like you're making a very powerful argument, and Michele and I would agree, is that we really haven't had any, we there's no market for social innovation, for social experiment. There's no way of encouraging people to do this. There's no way of sharing those ideas globally, seeing what's working, what's not working. We've tried to do this inside of certain organizations, but it does seem like this problem of innovating at the institutional level, we really haven't put our minds to how to scale that up. And it's always going to be difficult, but how to do it in a more disciplined way, simple hypotheses, localized tests, sharing the results, learning together, leveraging up. It just, the kind of big science that you see that did the Human Genome Project or did Large Hadron, it just doesn't seem we brought that kind of energy and thought together around how we evolve, our institutions.
Well, let me say a few things about that. So the first one is to really agree with your last point. The attitude that I usually get to social innovation is either that it's trivial or that it's impossible. And often people toggle back and forth between those two things in the same sentence. They'll be like, oh, there's nothing. I mean, like some voting, whatever. That's some like little trivial, like whatever. That's not a real science problem. That's just, or they'll say, oh, but that'll never change. I mean, that sort of institution is complete. I mean, that's just like, it's worthless to do. Like the attitude that, no, it's hard, but it requires, but with, a good investment and a good amount of work, we can actually make major change. That's the attitude that we need to get to, because you'll never make important progress on anything if you have the attitude that it's completely out of your hands. It's either completely fixed or it's trivial. It's only if we make concerted and coordinated investments that we have a chance of making that social change. Doing so, however, requires what I would call a different fundamentally approach to experimentation. Even in your language, you talked about sort of randomized controlled trials or whatever. That's not the right way to think about social innovation, I don't think. The right way to think about it is experimentation with rather than experimentation on. In experimentation on, you view the things that you're experimenting on as kind of passive. You know what you want to measure. You go into it, you try to control as much as possible. And that's the way that most social science experimentation works. That's the paradigm people have come to. That's A/B testing. But real social innovation doesn't come from that. Real social innovation comes from experimentation with. And by the way, that's true for most physical technologies, because what really matters about physical technologies is the way they integrate with social systems. So we don't go and do a randomized controlled trial for the most part. I'm not saying we don't do this in any context, but it's not really very useful to take a VR headset and randomly assign some people are going to live with a VR headset for a year and other people are not. And then we're going to measure, I don't know, the temperature of their skin or the, their rating on some self-reported scale after a year. Nobody knows what people are going to do with VR headsets, and they're going to create things for it anyways. And that's going to be part of what's interesting. Experimentation with is a process where there's a circular relationship between the innovator and the participants, where that's a relationship of much greater equality. It's not like I'm just going to measure some thin thing from you. You're actually going to speak back to me. And then my next iteration is going to come from the process of having worked with your community, and it's going to spread horizontally rather than to the experimenter and then out through.
I would add to that, Glenn, because I 100% agree, and I think that's been a limit. Not that it doesn't have its value, but that's been a limit of a lot of behavioral science research, the experimental research. It is in kind of a laboratory, and it's mainly aimed at characterizing behavior or characterizing a system, right? Most famously, all the work that's been done to understand kind of our intellectual biases and so on, and you can do that. But the kind of innovation you're talking about is not simply innovation to characterize, it's innovation to change. It's focused on invention, not simply on understanding. And I can tell you within the business school world, almost none of that is going on. Literally, all of my colleagues working in business schools all over the world doing all of this research and all of their academic journals, a tiny, tiny fraction of that research is actually what you would call kind of experimentation with, innovation with, designed to test new methods, new tools, so on, to see what works. It's just we can come back to why, but it's basically not happening. Which is kind of insane.
Yeah, and let me come back as well to, like, is it easier to technologically innovate versus socially innovate? And I think in some sense, for the reasons you said, yes. And at the same time, I would sort of challenge it, because I would say it's true it may be easier, but it's also almost completely useless to technologically innovate without socially innovating, at least to some extent. So, like, there's a great example that the great UI theorist Donald Norman always gives, which is that video conferencing, like we're doing right now, was invented in the 1880s. It was first demoed in the 1920s. It was first commercialized in the 1950s. But and actually, his book ends before this even comes. He says in his book, and it has never really gained broad adoption. It finally did as a result of a pandemic, not as a result of any technological advance, because of a social fact, right? And therefore, it's like, yes, you can innovate technologies in some controlled sense, but has almost no meaning to any human life, except for like a bomb, like where it's really a negative impact on human life, right? It has no positive impact on human life unless it's accompanied by at least some social innovation.
Yeah, and what you need for that, Glenn, at least what I'm hearing you say, and I would agree with, if I'm interpreting you correctly, is that you almost need this needs to be elevated at the level of a societal priority. Like, it is a fundamental. This is what limits the performance of our society is sort of our institutional architecture, the degree to which we innovate, and we just need to all focus on that. I mean, I think at least the most salient example of that in recent history, at least when it comes to innovation within firms, in my mind, is a scientific management that during the progressive era, where Taylor had done a few experiments, Frederick Taylor, and it kind of seemed to work, but it wasn't 100% sure. But the whole idea of removing waste and increasing efficiency became a huge priority, right? A way to solve problems of inequality, of making things more affordable for more people, right? And it was through that kind of embrace of this as a real priority that then the technology of scientific management got applied more broadly. And right now there is no consensus right around that. Yeah, I mean, people might say, things that we can improve things at the margin, or maybe we should fight, reduce inequality a little bit, or so on. But we don't have anything like that ambition of a whole, of a deep rethinking about our institutions. I don't know if you agree with that.
Quite the opposite, Michele. It's like we're profoundly socially constipated on this issue. We've got this notion that, like, we're hopeless about it. We think, like, some people say it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Like, there's way more science fiction which is about catastrophe than there is about, like, actually different social systems coming into existence.
Can I just back up 1 second, though? Because there's a premise which I'm not arguing with, but I just think we need to make it explicit, and explore it for a moment. Because you're arguing, Glenn, that our social institutions, and by the way, in many ways we agree. It's the premise of our book on humanocracy. But you're arguing that institutional innovation has lagged far beyond technological innovation, and we're paying a price for that. That our institutions in some way are failing us. Can you, like, fairly concisely, can you give us a bit of your diagnosis? Like, so if we need to accelerate the pace of social innovation, why? What are the failings? What are the problems that we're trying to solve that can only be solved if we're able to reimagine some of these fundamental ways our institutions work?
Let me give two sides of a story, and this applies to both of them. There's those people out there who are like, we need way faster technological progress. We need way higher economic growth, etc. Well, if you want way higher economic growth, the fundamental thing that any economic theory will tell you is you need to accelerate increasing returns processes. You need innovation that is not depletable. You need more networks. You need more, like, people working together. You need to take advantage of those economies of scale. That's where all innovation comes from. But we also know that market systems don't do that. We know just basic economic theory says that market systems, when you have those sort of networks, whatever, they'll tend to get monopolies, or there will tend to be underfunding of those things that generate all that value, all that innovative activity. So if you're someone who's like raw economic growth, you need this. If you're someone who's more of a degrowth mindset, like we're going to destroy the planet, we're going to blow ourselves up, whatever, you also desperately need this, because the market system is going to throw off all these externalities, and arguably those are destroying the world, right? Arguably they're causing climate change, which could wipe us out. They could lead to some AI system which might kill everybody. They're destroying the oceans, whatever. But those externalities, those systemic effects of these increasing returns technologies, these accelerating exponential technologies, none of those are being captured by our current schemes, and we're generating these externalities at a pace that we can't keep up with, that we have no governance mechanism to keep up with those externalities, and eventually we just fall behind them and they just eat us. Either side that you're on, whether you think the biggest problem in the world is not enough growth, which is some chunk of people, or the biggest problem in the world is like we're going to destroy ourselves, or if you think inequality is the biggest issue, and we haven't figured out how to have an egalitarian society in this world. Like in all of those paradigms, it becomes incredibly important to address this problem of like, how do we do democracy or management of these common effects at scale?
Can I ask you, though, Glenn, because one could argue, yes, you have externalities and you have problems of monopoly due to increasing returns to scale, but we do have tools right now in our arsenals, but taxation, carbon tax for pollution, for instance, or like fierce antitrust. We just are not willing to use them. So it's less about inventing new ways of tackling these issues and more about applying existing tools more vigorously. And what do you say to that?
I would disagree. I don't actually think that those tools will really do the job, because you can do antitrust, you can slap down some company that becomes a monopoly, right? But slapping down a company as they become a monopoly doesn't actually solve the underlying problem. You try to break up Facebook, you'll get another network effect, unless you find a way to actually manage that new way of us interacting with each other as a sort of some form of a common resource. And like the standard public utility approach doesn't work because it's international, and like it's just we don't actually know how to manage that as some sort of a genuine increasing returns public. We don't know how to do that. So that's not going to work there. Is taxation going to work? Well, traditional forms of taxation are either going to slow investment, or they are and they're going to miss a lot of the like non-physical assets that are now critical to this world. So they're not even really going to extract the relevant benefits from that. Do carbon taxes work? Well, how do you monitor carbon in a way that isn't like a surveillance state that owns the entire world? Not at all clear. And even if you think that works, how do you do the innovation to come up with the new technologies that make the carbon tax not so burdensome? The carbon tax will create some incentive for those, but if the innovation machine isn't working well, then you don't actually overcome the underlying problem, right? Or even if you think carbon tax is going to do it all magically, we haven't managed to pass a carbon tax. So how is it that we actually build social systems that can quickly, and it's been a while, right? And what if we have some new thing that comes along that's much worse than global warming, which it could be like this AI risk stuff, right? And we only have 5 years to address it, right? And we can't just like sit around waiting for the carbon tax to work its way through. So like I actually don't think any of those examples are ones where the playbook is getting the job done.
I mean, I certainly would agree with that in the sense, and that the way we might put it is that the problems we face are multiplying much faster than our organizations are becoming more capable, right? There's just a lag between the speed, the complexity of these new challenges, whatever they are, the risk that AI may pose, the global warming and so on, then our organizations become more capable. I might like to come back for just a moment on like why this argument that we're not really innovating around our institutions. And in many ways, we're very sympathetic to that argument, right? I mean, we've talked about within our world, within the world of management, right, which is how organizations turn inputs into outputs, that we've seen a definitely an S curve there. That over the last 40 or so years, there's been very little fundamental innovation in the way large companies are run, and that's why we see flattening productivity and so on. But I guess the question is, why is that flattened out? Because I could argue that we're seeing more social innovation right now than we've ever seen in human history, right? Social media is the biggest social experiment we've ever done as a species, with no hypotheses, with no real clear understanding of where. But I can tell you, it is changing how cognitive development happens in kids. It's changing how relationships happen, how people meet each other. It has enormous consequences and a huge amount of controversy and people on both sides. So it's not as if like social innovation is not happening, but it doesn't seem to be happening in any kind of thoughtful, disciplined way. It just, suddenly we're connected. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the social media is a great example. Like, there's nothing derived from some sort of like normative social theory crossed with sociology that went into any of how social media has evolved. Social media has been like, someone's like, oh, I can put this little tweet out there, or like, let's just
and by contrast, I think people very well understood that this was a dopamine delivery system. It is based on deep psychology. It is based on deep understanding of how human beings respond to particular incentives. So, whether we want to talk about that or not, but it wasn't just, let's see what happens. I mean, this is all built on very, very deep understanding of how the human brain works.
Yeah, but what you just said was incredibly individualistic. It was not actually about the forms of social organization that we're creating. It was about addiction of people at an individual level to their interactions. And it was funded by this advertising business model, which was really a fundamentally individualistic business model. It's like, what if you'd had things that were based on, how people are actually interacting socially, and like, what is the nature of that organization, and is that organization perform? Like, that's interesting, right? What's much less interesting is something that's purely based on the capitalist incentive that, like, I want to get this person engaged so I can sell something to them. That's fundamentally not social media. That's really anti-social media. It's like harnessing the social relations to break down the social fabric, rather than harnessing it to build an operative social fabric,
So Glenn, so far we've talked about the need for accelerating social innovation, the fact that we don't have the right mechanisms for that. We just taxation and regulation may not do the job. Now you and your colleagues have proposed a number of mechanisms that could actually solve some of this dilemma, right? So that would advance, plurality, community and decentralization. So can you maybe pick one or two of these? Perhaps it's quadratic voting, perhaps it's another, and tell us a little bit more about such a mechanism.
Well, let me give you just like a overview of what I think of as the key properties of what I would call democratic or just thoughtful decision making in relatively small groups. And what I would say those are deliberation, compromise, and plurality. So what do I mean by those, or pluralism? Deliberation is that we have a process of talking through all of the issues from all of our perspectives and trying to find creative solutions that are not like just embracing one perspective or the other, but instead like get past the divide, right? Synthesis, yeah. And anyone who's ever been in part of like a thoughtful group decision knows that that's a core of what goes on, right? A second thing is that eventually you have to make a decision. So you can't go on and do that deliberation forever. So you need some way, once you get to it, to make compromises, which requires people giving up on the things that are not important to them and getting the things that are most important to them, or getting in the future on an issue that's more important to them their way, right? And the third element is pluralism, which is to say, we don't erase the differences between us in this process. We actually celebrate them. We view them as the source of progress, that we had to have this sort of conflict of ideas. And we try to defer to people on the areas of their expertise as much as possible. And when there are areas that involve multiple expertise, we seek sort of consensus or unlikely consensus across those groups. That is, we don't just have like a vote. We actually say, no, we need to make sure we hear all the different perspectives. Even if one perspective is held by a majority, it's when we're able to get consensus across the different perspectives that something goes forward, right? And those mechanisms are so critical to how we make good decisions in small groups. Like any thoughtful business process will tell you about how to do this in small groups. But how is it that you scale that to large groups of people? My view is that there are tools that are emerging that let us do that. And what are those tools? Well, to do deliberation, you basically need to go beyond broadcast to what I would call broad listening. You have to have one person be able to digest all the perspectives that are in a conversation in a reasonable period of time. And machine learning, statistics, artificial intelligence are perfect tools for doing that. What they basically do is they take a very large amount of information and they're able to condense it into a small number of representative perspectives that can offer. So
can you just on that one point, can I stop you? Where have you seen, what is the best current case of where AI or machine learning has taken vast quantities of qualitative text that reflects the opinions, the viewpoints of, thousands of different people and made sense of that in some compelling way? Where would we look to see that?
the best example, I think, is the Taiwanese digital democracy. And they had a phenomenal deliberation using a very primitive platform called Polis that just scratches the surface of doing this. But they used this platform to come up with how they were going to regulate ride sharing in the country. And it was a very creative solution that I think almost everyone would agree was like an excellent solution, and it came out of precisely this type of process.
Can you unpack that process for us a little bit, Glenn? Just exactly how the platform worked. I know it's rough, but how it matched people of different perspectives.
So basically what happens is that everyone in plain text enters in what they think about the issue, right? Just, it could be emotive, it could be, directional, but they put that in. And then people get a random selection of things that are input by other people. And they just say whether they agree or disagree. That's it. No response, etc. People then get clustered based on the pattern of their opinions. And then from that cluster, the opinion that got the most strong support is surfaced as the representative opinion of that group. Everyone is then able to read through all of those representative opinions. And then those representative opinions form the basis of sort of the next stage of the conversation, where people now start proposing things that they think could get consensus across those different groups. And the rating in the next version is based on the degree of unlikely consensus you manage to achieve across those groups. And then those things surface. And you can kind of iterate that process until you get, rough consensus on a set of opinions. And this is what we do for governance within RadicalxChange as well, by the way.
Right. But and just to give people a scale of the number of participants, this wasn't just, the equivalent of a New England, town meeting, right? It's like
tens of thousands of people, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people in some cases.
Right. And they've done this now for several issues, right? So this has proven itself to be a valid way of...
It's not just several issues. They actually have a platform that where this is the core component, where a quarter of the country are monthly active users. So it's like it's almost like the social media landscape is a significant component of it, is precisely this type of a process.
And can you say more about then the impact this has had on the traditional political institutions of Taiwan? How have they kind of adjusted to this reality of a quarter of the million, a quarter of the population just deliberating on issues that they were exclusively responsible for, pre-platform, right?
Well, I'll give you the best example is the one that was actually at the genesis of this, which is the way this actually got started at a large scale. It was initially developed within this sort of civic hacker community, but it went to scale when there was an invasion of the National Assembly. So think January 6th, but in Taiwan, right? But they actually managed to occupy the National Assembly. The issue was around a trade agreement with China and the fears that would negatively impact the freedom of the tech sector within Taiwan. And they used this platform for the protesters, rather than just all, being rowdy, to come up with a platform that they would demand the government adopt. And that platform was, rather than, being the source of social division or whatever, it was so coherent and clear and persuasive that the government directly adopted the legislative language that was generated by this group. And then it not only did that, it said that this was such an effective process that every government minister is going to have a reverse mentor that comes from this movement. A young person that would help them learn how to do their job better. And then it was so popular, they didn't think that was enough. They kicked out the government at the time, and they put in a new government that was allied to this movement. And that new government appointed the leader of this woman, Audrey Tong, as the digital minister, in charge of building this platform. And it's so legitimate that like some large fraction of all the things the government does basically bubble up out of this civic community.
That's pretty amazing.
Very, very, very compelling example. And we'd encourage anybody who wants to know more to dig into Glen's work, because it is probably, I guess, the best case study right now, Glen, of how this can be used at scale. Let me talk for a moment about our own experience with this, because we're kind of very interested in how to scale this up, and you might have a thought, Glen.
Just one thing to put in, Gary, is
please.
We didn't talk about the pluralism or the compromise, but on those issues as well, we have just as clear sort of uses, and so like on all these elements, we're really starting to see how these things can both individually develop and come together. And as I said, we're just at the start of all of it. Like, these tools are very primitive, but if we had anywhere near the focus, the funding that in total that's gone onto this is in the order of millions. The funding that goes into AI every year is in the order of tens of billions, and yet it's having these society-wide impacts. So like, there's just a huge case for us making the sort of social investments in this kind of stuff that we've made in AI technology.
I 100% agree. Some years back now, it's more than a decade, we started building our own collaborative problem-solving platform, because I couldn't find anything out there that actually allowed you to bring thousands of people together to co-solve really difficult problems. And I'd seen, the growth and development of the open source community, and was pretty familiar on how that worked, and how bits of code could be forked, how it got integrated into the kernel, and so on. But we were looking inside of organizations, and what we found was there was no broadly participative approach for developing strategy, for helping you think about how the organization needs to evolve, what new capabilities do you need to build, and so on. So we built something called CrowdLab that we've now used in all kinds of quite large organizations around the world, where we're involving tens of thousands of people in these questions. And recognizing that, whether it's strategy or whether it's how your organization evolves, how you evolve the institution, what you need is a lot of ideas, you need a lot of peer review, you need a lot of experimentation, and the pace at which any organization can evolve is kind of an arithmetic function of how many smart experiments are you running. But here's what we found. So the platform, I think, works very well. In fact, I think it's the best one that I know of in the world right now. The challenge that we find is CEOs, leaders, are very reluctant to ask the entire organization about their opinion on anything. And I think they understand reflexively that when you do that, you're giving up some control. You're no longer driving the conversation. They understand that when thousands or hundreds of people start to have a point of view on something, and you do start to get that consensus, and it does coalesce, you have to do something about it. You cannot say, this is not important to us, or, we're simply not going to do it. And so I think, it's not like we need some huge AI breakthrough to be able to use these platforms as Taiwan is using them, as we're using our little one. But you do need to believe that we have to accelerate the pace of innovation here, and you do have to be willing to listen. You do have to be willing to give up a certain degree of control and invite, and start this conversation. And that, at least for us, has often been the sticking point.
I think it's very important that we bring in different types of social forces to making this work. So, for example, the ESG movement, it's got that G at the end. G in for governance should not just be about like the guys aren't stealing money from the shareholders. It should be about, are we really giving participatory engagement to the people in the organization? And by the way, I don't know if you guys know Colin Meyer, a guy you should definitely have on your show. Wonderful person, business thinker, very influential, including on our CEO at Microsoft. He's a big believer in this. He really thinks that's what governance is about, you know? And he's not as focused on the sort of technology development and organizational structure as we are, but he really believes in it. So that's absolutely, I think, one thing to leverage. Another thing to leverage is this focus on technology for democracy, which is increasingly coming out. You know, if it becomes that technology for democracy is just as much of a focus for societies as, AI innovation is, it'll become that your organization is not keeping up with the times if you're not participating in that, right? And then it will become a priority for those CEOs.
You know, we did this interesting piece of research, Glenn. Sorry to interrupt, but I just want to build on that for a second. You know, some years ago, we got very into this question of why do some organizations, why have they enjoyed long periods of dominance? You know, take apart, you know, a real monopoly like Standard Oil or whatever, but why do they enjoy long periods of dominance? And when you go back and you look, what you find is that happened because of institutional innovation. Not, it was never the result of technology. It wasn't the result of a new strategy, but it was, you know, it was Toyota figuring out how do you do distributed problem solving, where you've trained, you know, tens of thousands of people to be able to solve complex problems. Or you know, it was a company like Ford figuring out how do you manage huge amount of vertical integration and do that productively, and can run a larger, more complex operation than anybody in history had ever done so. And so if you look at history, this kind of organizational and institutional innovation, it was important to why countries, you know, emerged stronger than others, but also why companies did. And yet, if you go into the typical organization and you ask the CEO, like, well, what is your methodology? What is the strategy for organizational innovation, right? How many experiments are you running this year? Why are you running those and not others? How did those emerge? They look at you like they can all tell you what they're doing with product innovation. They can tell you maybe what they're doing, you know, in R&D, but most like have nothing to say when you ask them, like, what is your strategy for purposeful, fast, smart organizational innovation?
Let me give you one illustration from Microsoft that I think is really salient. I think many people have seen a cartoon showing what different organizations look like. And at Microsoft, you know, famously, there's like this thing of the different organizations shooting each other. And, you know, that's gotten better under our great CEO, Satya Nadella, but it's still a real challenge that we face. And my office, the office of the CTO, is to a significant extent charged with trying to facilitate those cross-group collaborations. But if you think about that, that's fundamentally the same issue as public goods. So you think public goods, you know, whatever, that I'm working on is some abstract problem. You know, for companies, it's absolutely critical. That notion of common infrastructure that may not be in the interest of any individual group within the company to produce, but that, you know, you'd love to have a V team bubble up and get the funding to provide it to everyone within the company. So these questions are just as relevant for companies as they are for governments and any community. They're also relevant for local governments. You know, you think about public goods. That's really, if you read like the New Argonauts or a great business book like that, how local areas thrive. It's the intercompany linkages that are created by those social relationships, right?
So this has been super helpful. I would like you to finish to walk us through your framework, right? So you talked about deliberation, you give us an example, but there are two other elements.
Absolutely. So let's talk about compromise. So when we're in small groups, we know that we're not going to get our way, even after we've deliberated and so forth all the time. We know we'll have to give up on certain elements of things or give up on this occasion to get our way on other occasions where it's much more important to us. That's basically like a version of trade, but it's trade for a multilateral decision rather than a bilateral thing where I give up, you know, this, you know, in a bargain, we know that we always give up some things, we get other things. But when we're doing it with many, many people, how do we keep track of that? Money is not really a good currency or standard money is not, and there's lots of economic theory to talk about that. So the question then is, if you wanted to use economic theory to make those multilateral decisions, how would you do it? And there's a procedure called quadratic voting, which is about doing exactly that. It's optimally derived from economic theory. You can be shown to be an optimal way to make a collective decision. And the basic concept behind it is that everyone has some tokens that they can use to influence aspects of or a particular decision or choice of candidates. But the more influence they have on any given issue, the more expensive it becomes to have more influence on that. So it's expensive to be extreme. And again, this is something that I think is familiar from small group deliberations. It's much easier to have a small influence on many things than it is to have a large influence on any one thing. But you can't.
Can you give us an example in practice?
Yeah. So again, let's turn to Taiwan. Actually, a different thing in Taiwan. So this is called their presidential hackathon. They use this as a way to identify promising innovations of the sort that we were describing for the government, and to get them the attention that they need in order to get implemented at whatever the relevant agency or government level it is. And citizens participate in this. They receive a budget of tokens to allocate to the projects they consider most promising. Or if they think some projects are dangerous, they can actually vote those negative. They can vote a little bit on a lot of projects, or they can concentrate on one project, but then it becomes increasingly expensive for them to do that. And this system, then they choose basically winners based on this, who then receive sort of decreasingly powerful representations of the president of the republic, giving her blessing that this is something that is viewed as legitimate and exciting, and that she hopes the government, people within government, will adopt.
What would be an example of some of these issues they're voting on?
So these are actually not exactly issues; they're more like projects. So they would be, for example, a new way of distributing vaccines, or a way of keeping track of environmental damage in the country, or penalizing polluters, for example.
So rather than the horse trading or this debate taking place among bureaucrats, based on who can, get the president's buy-in, or who can, it sounds like they're pushing basically that. I mean, it's not quite horse trading, but they're this problem of prioritization. They're pushing it down
to citizens. And by the way, it can also happen in legislatures, because in many legislative caucuses are quite large to do that kind of horse trading in a very effective way. You actually end up, even within the legislative caucus, just having a few leaders do everything. And in Colorado, the state legislative Democrats decided to use this mechanism to do precisely that prioritization for the discretionary budget 3 years in a row now. And in fact, it was so successful that it's now spreading throughout the executive agencies in Colorado.
It's successful in what way, Glenn?
Well, it makes everyone feel that they had a real influence on the prioritization, even if they didn't get their way on everything. Because you can choose to either spread things out and have a little bit of influence on many things, in which case you're likely to get your way on several of them, or you can focus on one issue, in which case you're likely to get your way on that one thing, but miss out on having any influence on the others. So it gives a way for everyone to participate and to have for everyone to be winners, basically. That's what compromise does, is it allows everyone to be winners, because they can win on the things that matter most to them.
On that point, you could end up with people being a little bit satisfied, but with a suboptimal outcome for the collective, potentially, right? So it sounds though that this system allows you to get to decisions that are collectively kind of optimal as well.
Well, there's a theorem that says that now, and you could show in laboratories that works. Like, knowing exactly what's collectively optimal in an organization is very hard to do. Like, the subjective experience of people using a mechanism is going to be much more determinative than is some completely measurable set of outcomes. I think most technologies like this are measured by the degree to which people feel satisfied with them and they spread, rather than some external criterion of optimality. But there's also been laboratory experiments that do show that it performs very well. along those dimensions also.
Let me ask a practical question, Glenn. I didn't know about quadratic voting, but years ago when I wrote The Future of Management, I argued that big strategic decisions in most organizations needed to be put kind of in this sense to a vote. Let me pick at random. Let's say you're Intel and we're back in 2006 and they're going to pass on the decision to make chips for the iPhone. It seems to me that was the kind of question that you put to a lot of people in the organization. You say, that's one thing, we're also going to do this acquisition of this company here, and we have this new fab that we want to build in country X or Y. And, and you can present a certain amount of data around that and let people evaluate, like, what should we be doing as a firm? But I guess the question is, and the same thing, in Colorado or in Taiwan, how do you, some of these decisions are you're making a bet, not just on a project with a headline, right? Is how's that project going to be implemented? How are we going to keep score of whether it's working or not? I mean, it's not about saying, yeah, let's give $2 billion to homelessness. It's like, well, how exactly are you going to tackle that problem? What metrics are you going to use to know whether we're making progress or not? So how do voters get the depth of insight or perspective around this that allows them to make kind of an informed rather than just, oh yeah, that sounds important to me?
Well, I mean, that's the role of the deliberation prior to the compromise, right? Deliberation is about information, coming up with better potential solutions, describing the space, shaping it, and compromise is about action direction. Now, that doesn't mean that one process is going to be the end of things and that it will prescribe everything or that it's an autonomous organization or whatever. There's going to be more levels of things, but you can still but that's true of any contract, right? I mean,
can I just ask, in the case of Colorado, what determines which priorities people get put in front of them? How does that slate emerge of here's what we can do with our discretionary budget? I don't know whether that's 5 things or 20 things or 100 things, and then within each one of those things, how do you get a level of specificity around? Well, exactly here's what we're intending to do if you vote for that.
Well, I think in Colorado, there's been a process for many, many years of members being allowed to propose potential priorities for the discretionary budget. That has not changed. I think we could do better than that. I think we could use some of these deliberation tools to do better than that. But that's not the experiment that we ran with them. We just ran the experiment holding fixed their current proposal methodology. How do they actually allocate the funds in the end? Which I think is valid. But we can do better, and in fact, RadicalxChange has a platform called RadicalxChange Voice, which integrates these different aspects. So
again, just last question, just trying to be as specific as I can. In Colorado, when people are using their votes on these things, how much information do they have on these different priorities? Is it a sentence? Is it a paragraph? Is it a deep project? Or
there's basically a draft piece of legislation for each one of them, or like a full
okay.
A proposal that's going to be funded if this passes.
So you can go quite deep if you want to in terms of what you're actually, okay.
And Glenn, sorry, on the presidential hackathon, so there people are instead not voting on sort of how to allocate the budgets, but rather on projects that they think ought to go forward, right? And they're just expressing their interest in which ones need to do that. And it sounds like, can you maybe say a little bit more about the level of context people have around those projects? I mean, is that, again,
there's a demo.
Part of what happens in the deliberation?
Like a pitch. Think of it as like a hackathon. So, in a hackathon, when they choose the winners of a hackathon, each one gives a demo or a presentation about their project. And it's similar here. Okay.
And how many people in this presidential hackathon are engaged in voting? So is it? I mean, if you think about this as a second stage after deliberation, is there like a drop off where you only have certain people who are really hardcore, and when I get into the weeds,
I think it was like a few 100,000.
Okay, can you envision? Because you mentioned earlier that companies have public goods that are internal, that is, that are investments that they can make that benefit multiple divisions, and so if you allocate funding at the level of each division or business unit or whatever, you are going to get it to suboptimal outcomes because no one really wants to invest for everybody else. Can you envision having this kind of approach, whether it's quadratic voting. I mean, we talked a little bit about deliberation, but the quadratic voting.
Sure, sure. Take the example of the presidential hackathon. I mean, I think this parallels things that go on in companies all the time. Like much, if not most, of what my, our CEO does is that people present various things to him, and he sort of has differing degrees of enthusiasm for what they present. They're kind of like ideas about something that the company needs. And he doesn't ever order anyone really to like go off and do that. I mean, very, very rarely he does. Usually what he does is he expresses sort of different degrees of enthusiasm, and then people use that enthusiasm to try to get support in their command chain or try to, get the CFO to allocate funds or something like that. That's really what this process is. It's just that rather than it being the CEO sitting there, it's some process by which the whole company brings its collective wisdom to bear on what things deserve that signal of enthusiasm,
That is certainly our model. I mean, the ability, if you think, even, let's assume you have really smart people running a company. And I think that's usually the case. But if you think of the amount of intelligence and wisdom that has to be brought to bear to make these big decisions on whether we invest, X, Y, or Z, there's no small group of people that commands that amount of knowledge. It's just like impossible. And what we see again and again and again in organizations is you have a group of people at the top who have a lot of emotional equity in the past, who have been set up as judge, jury, and executioner of every new proposal, new idea. And they systematically overinvest in what is at the expense of what could be. We've argued for years that in making any critical decision in organizations, you need to overrepresent the people at the fringe, the people that are a long way from head office, the relative new hires, people who've worked in other industries. But the concentration of decision-making power is fundamentally toxic to the evolutionary capacity of an organization and the likelihood you're going to see the future and bet on the right things. So at least what you're describing for us is this is not a nice to have. I mean, to the extent we hang on to those more centralized decision-making structures, as we've seen again and again and again, the incumbents are going to miss the future.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. We need good ways to do it, and I think that these offer them. So should I turn to the last one about pluralism? So pluralism is about the notion that even though we need to come together and make these joint decisions, we still need to modularize. We can't do everything as a whole. And so we have to recognize that there are going to be these different groups. And it's not just individuals, right? Like the market and standard democratic vision is there's just individuals and then there's the collective. But pluralism recognizes, no, there's many different organizations, both hierarchically and intersecting, related to each other. And we need to recognize those organizations in making decisions. We need to recognize them in the way that we organize. So quadratic voting doesn't do this. Quadratic voting, every individual gets these points, right? But actually, as Gary was pointing out, and McKelly was highlighting, it's not just individuals. Organizations have to be important here. I mean, in many circumstances, you might want to have some points given to each one of several organizations, but then one organization is bigger than another organization. So should it have more? Those are the questions that are critically important. It's how do we think about social difference? What we actually want to do is create cooperation across social difference, not across individuals. And having systems that actually explicitly take that into account, both as a way to delegate to the organizations the things that are within their purview, so that they really do get authority over those things, and not just the formal organizations, but there could be V teams, there could be anything, any group that is the set of relevant experts should have the relevant decisions decentralized to them in a dynamic way. And at the same time, when we make decisions that cut across those groups, we need to seek consensus across different perspectives, different social groups, and not just even a quadratically weighted support from different individuals. And social networks are an incredibly powerful potential substrate for us to do that, because they track social difference in a dynamic rather than a static way, not just some org structure, but what's the on the ground reality of people's relation to each other.
I'm not sure I'm tracking. Are you talking about how do you decide where individual units, let's say in a large organization, have autonomy and can act without collaboration or without, what's the problem this you're trying to solve here?
Well, I think there's two elements. One is what you're saying is like, how do you modularize? How do you give the authority to go forward to smaller groups, but not just smaller groups that are like 10 years ago we set up these organizations and whatever, but like any emergent smaller group, right? That may have emerged since you last redid the org structure. And second, and relatedly, how, when you have to make decisions that cut across those groups, do you consider like who's the voting population, right? Like in quadratic voting, we just had a bunch of individuals. But like, as I pointed out, that's not even really the right way to think about social difference. Like, it might be that you want each organization to vote, but then organizations are of different size. So you don't just want each organization, like, you have to actually think about that whole set of social relations when you think about what are the set of entities that are participating in this process. And there's not just one set of organizations, right? Because there's all those intersecting V teams. And once you think about all of that social complexity, you need a whole different way of conceptualizing both these deliberative and compromise type processes to account for all these different dimensions of social difference. Like, if you want to take the Colorado example, right? Well, they just did it with the members of the Democratic caucus. But what if you had the Democrats and the Republicans? And within the Democratic caucus, you probably have the Black caucus, and maybe there's some Republicans that are part of the Black caucus. And like, how do you want to keep track of all that stuff when you think about like, what are the sources of, this quadratic thing and whatever that you actually want to take into account?
Yeah, unpack that a little bit more practically, because do you see a place where somebody's come up with a solution here that you can balance the interests of the individual and the collective, that you can manage appropriately the decision rights among groups with, I mean, let me give you a practical example. In most large companies, you have big established divisions that represent 80-90% of existing revenues. The executive vice presidents who run those things typically been in the company for 20 years. They're very powerful. They have the ear of the CEO. They can always go and win their case. They negotiate very well. And people with new ideas who are more junior or whatever have a very hard time getting heard. And so you have extraordinarily unequal, you have all these power asymmetries that have nothing to do with the quality of the underlying idea. It's just, it's sheer size or political influence. So are there ways of balancing that out in kind of smart ways, or am I mischaracterizing the problem here under this challenge of managing the plurality?
So, like an example I would give is, think about the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is not a simple democracy. A lot of people complain about this. I actually think it's part of its genius, but it's instead meant to over-represented small entities within the conceptual framework of the United States. Small states get overrepresented, and in Lebanon, they have a similar system, but for religions. Small religions get overrepresented because there's a history of religious violence there, and they want to avoid conflict between those religions.
That may not be the best advertisement, but keep going.
well, yeah, but so those systems are very prevalent. I think are very important, and yet also we have a lot of reasons to be skeptical of them, right? Because they don't really keep up with the times, right? The states are no longer the main divisions. Now our main divisions are ethno-racial, they're political parties, they're rural versus urban, etc. And so what you'd really like to do in some ways is like have federalism to the African-American community, so that if there was like a murder within the African-American community, it should be African-American police, African-American, within from that community, judges, jury, they should be judging that. I mean, do they want to defund whatever? They should choose. It doesn't really affect anyone else. I mean, I'm not saying that every murder is that way, but really it's something happening within that community in the same way that, states manage the murders within those communities, right? Unless it's an interstate murder. So like you'd want to be able to delegate to those things. But the thing is, we don't have a dynamic way of tracking those lines of difference. Our ways of tracking lines of difference are extremely static. They're stuck in the past. And conversely, it's not just that notion, what I would call subsidiarity or delegation. It's also the issue of finding consensus. So like, the Senate overweights those small units, but it doesn't overweight African Americans in the same way, or it doesn't overweight like, small religious groups, or like there should be some way to keep track of when there's a marginalized social group, just as you were referring to, Gary, and overhear the voice of that marginalized social group, because those marginalized social groups are the ones that are not going to be as homogeneous as the other ones, and therefore are going to bring those different perspectives that need to be heard in the process of decision making.
And Glenn, is there a mechanism of sorts that helps you? I mean, is this still like a conceptual idea, or is there something that allows you to find the right locus of localization, which is not just as you say about geographic, or it's about finding the right kind of dimension of intersectionality, I guess, to bring to bear, right?
We haven't figured out all the mechanics of it. We're working on it, and we're actually trying to start. We should include you guys. Actually, we're trying to start really a new field of academic research that will be around trying to build these types of mechanisms. But I think that social graphs give us a powerful tool to use in thinking about this, because they make the notion of social distance much more precise and much more dynamic and flexible, right? There's all kinds of operations you could apply to social graphs to think about, are these people from a different or a very similar perspective, right? And in fact, they've been used for that purpose in science studies. There's a wonderful set of work that I really recommend to you guys. You should check out, by James Evans, where they use the graph of co-publications in science to understand the social dynamics and to prove that most innovation comes from bridging previously non-communicating scientific communities, rather than either from isolated genius or from the existing organizations, right? And so that harnessing that power of surprising connection, I think, is the key to organizational performance, to scientific performance, to economic performance. And that's the sort of thing that we need, and as well as to solving problems of social justice, as we were talking about in politics.
Yeah, I mean, certainly this challenge of how do you hear the underrepresented voices? I mean, that is something that is absolutely crucial, and probably we're not very good at that. But also, how do you link disconnected constituencies where there's a chance to learn and a chance to solve problems in new ways? I mean, it's interesting, more generally, if you look at the people who often create breakthroughs in science, often they come from adjacent fields or other fields, right? They're not people who spent 30 years in that field. So I think, what you tend to find in a lot of organizations is the conversations over time, it's the same people talking about the same people around the same issue, and there's not a lot of connectivity, and pretty soon you have an echo chamber. So if that's part of the problem you guys are working on, that seems to me like super, super critical.
Yeah, so those three elements, deliberation, compromise, and pluralism, to me are the core of what makes for functional small groups. But, just as we pointed out with the pluralism, the incredible opportunity that we have with large groups is there's going to be so much more pluralism. There's all that greater potential energy, but we haven't figured out how to harness it in a way that addresses these problems. And that, to me, is sort of the essence of what social innovation can empower.
So, Glenn, can I come back, though, to something you mentioned earlier? Because it seems to me, and you'll correct me, but I think there's something that precedes the kind of deliberation. You first have to have some really interesting options to look at before I can deliberate on them. And what certainly we see in organizations, as I mentioned earlier, there's very little organizational innovation going on. People generally, they're not looking at a really interesting portfolio of new ways that we can use to set priorities, allocate resources, onboard new employees, do compensation. And a lot of what we do with our management hackathons, and this is literally true, we'll first educate people on what does it mean to innovate around the organization. We give them a new set of principles to do that. But in a large company, we're generating thousands, and I mean thousands of ideas on how we change all those things, right? If we want to be more open, if we want more meritocracy, if we want more transparency, if we want, whatever, what is your idea about how we might change all of the ways we run our organization. And so for us, always the first step is, how do you generate a really robust portfolio of options? And then you can have the deliberation, because most people are stuck in a pretty orthodox view. They just assume that a company the size of Microsoft needs 8 levels, right? They've never seen one that has 3 levels or 0 levels. They just assume that a small group of leaders at the top should set strategy or make the big resource allocation decisions. They just assume that your boss is in charge of your career or has the biggest voice in doing performance review. And our experience is, like, first you have to really quite intentionally turn upside down. So you have to reveal and turn upside down all those taken for granted assumptions that we just inherited from the past. This is the way it works. And we don't even think that way. And then you have to be quite intentional about creating a really robust portfolio of alternatives. And then you can start to deliberate on them, and then you can turn them into experiments. But I think, most organizations, most struggle with this even in products and technology. They don't have a very robust, a very large population of new strategic options and alternatives. Certainly when it comes to innovating around the organization, they have, in my experience, like, very few have any process that generates a really interesting and rich array of alternatives to the status quo.
But see, to me, that's exactly what the pluralism element of this is about. It's about the deliberate fostering of sub-communities which are novel and create bridges between existing communities, because if you just have bridges within the communities, you just reproduce the same set of ideas, right? Like, a new community is going to be a V team formed around something that they can't find in their existing organization. And you need an incentive structure that, not from the top down, but provides the incentives for a bottom-up formation of those new types of configurations. In the standard capitalist world, we call this entrepreneurship ecosystem. But the reality is, entrepreneurship doesn't get even close to the power that you can have when you deliberately bring different sorts of people together, rather than just say, oh, there's this pot of money that can pursue, you make some money in the market. If you actually have something that deliberately fosters those connections, you have the potential to just get much more generative things. You gave the example of innovators coming from the margins. One great example of this is that the germ theory was invented hundreds of years before it was actually applied. It was discussed, but it wasn't really used in a practical way to address the problem until there was a person who was, I think, a surgeon, a physician, and someone who knew how to use a microscope all at the same time. And those were completely separate professions. They had no relationship to each other. And the notion that there was some integrated concept of biology was just like, that wasn't in the imaginary. These were different professions. This person happened to, his father was a surgeon, and his, he was trained in another field, whatever. And so he just happened to be at the intersection of these things that created lightning. You know what I mean? And that is what we need to be fostering the possibility of in a deliberate way, using these types of mechanisms.
Yeah, that is for sure. I think the chances of getting a true breakthrough is very much a function of the variety of perspectives you're bringing to bear on the problem. And that's why when we do this work in organizations, we're never talking to one group. We want the IT people there. We want the people out of HR there. We want the operators there, because we want the frontline there. Because the chance that any particular function part of the organization sees a new solution is pretty remote. It's when you bring all these different viewpoints together, which is kind of sad, because we have all these conversations right now about diversity, but if you look at most organizations, they're not very good at bringing really a lot of diverse voices together around complex problems.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that doing that in a scalable, deliberate way that harnesses the new technologies, that's what social networks were made for. Social networks have been used to get people more and more entrenched in their positions so that you can extract from them commercially. But social networks are really meant to do the opposite. The current social media environment is what I would call anti-social media. It's about reducing people's social connections or tightening them inward to take advantage of how that engages them. But what is possible with social networks is instead actually seeing those lines of difference and seeing them as the potential energy that becomes possible when we understand how people think differently.
Well, and in the business world, Glenn, I mean, the whole idea of social networking and social network analysis has been around for a while. I think it's becoming a little bit more prominent nowadays. But the way it's actually, though, being implemented and pursued is through in a very kind of instrumental way. So that that is, we want to find who the real influencers are in the organization, who really are the thought leaders, so we can kind of co-opt them, and so that they can then advance our agenda, right? As opposed to saying, let's just amplify their voice, let's empower them, let them be the drivers of change. So, again, it's one of those things where you have the technology, but if you're using the technology to kind of perpetuate the status quo, you're not going to get very far. So it does require that kind of reset in terms of, what are you trying to achieve through the technology?
So, Glenn, can I ask you a question? So, let's just back away for a moment. So your argument is, we need to pick up the pace of social and institutional innovation. We heartily agree. We wrote a book about that. So did you. You would say that right now we are not very systematic about that. We're not very thoughtful about that as a society. Yes, social change happens, like with social media, but we're not really being thoughtful about why and how and so on. So what are you saying to your colleagues at Microsoft about this, right? If you're talking to your boss, the chief technology officer at Microsoft, if he's talking to the CEO, what does Microsoft need to do, and or what are other organizations? Now, maybe we can end on the highest societal level, but just within an organization that's responsible for keeping pace in this crazy world. How are you telling them to become more thoughtful and more experimental about how they run your own company?
It's funny, Gary, because I have a lot of different potential things I could speak to at Microsoft, and I've ended up not speaking as much to the internal organizational things, even though I talk a little bit about it. I end up speaking more to the intersection with the broader politics. So I've definitely told people about these ideas, and there's interest and even enthusiasm for them, but I haven't had sort of the concerted way of trying to bring about change there that would really be required. I think, folks like you would focus more attention on doing that. I focused more on the intersection with the broader political environment.
So if we take the broader environment, there's plenty of reasons to be a little bit pessimistic right now about how we're, handling all this. As you were saying earlier, even, as we think about a plural society, even the ways we divide ourselves up and think about ourselves has been changing radically, way faster than our political parties can kind of reorient around that, and new kinds of fault lines are opening up all the time. And we know that trust in large institutions of all kinds is at an all-time low. So how do you think about solving it at the society level then?
Well, I think that the most promising routes involve a plurality of ways of getting there. So I think you have to, if you want bottom-up innovation, have cultural artifacts that inspire people to do things from the bottom up. You need to have technological structures that give them the possibility of experimenting with things. You need to have academic research that breaks open their way of thinking about things and forces them to confront ideas that are bolder and also that are sort of optimized to achieve those other types of goals. So I believe in operating on all of these fronts, but to really get the sort of catalysis of social focus around this, I think the most compelling route is actually the story of Taiwan. I think the story of Taiwan is extremely compelling for this moment in the political systems of liberal democracies, because it appeals to people who are on the right. They're on the front lines against China. It appeals to people on the left because she's the first transgender minister of a major government in the world. It speaks to markets and democracy, to decentralization, and to solidarity all at the same time. and she's just an incredibly compelling person. So I believe very strongly in working with and the narrative of that story as a way to catalyze the sort of common focus on this that we need.
And Glenn, so where can people find out more about the Taiwan story? Do you have any?
Yeah, there's a great Wired piece called "How Taiwan's Unlikely Digital Minister Hacked the Pandemic," and there's a deeper piece on the RadicalxChange website called "Taiwan's Digital Democracy." Both of those are really good entry points. But Audrey also has infinite podcasts, and she and I are working on a book. So hopefully that will be an even deeper exposition of some of these issues, and hopefully many more things as well.
We can put some of those links in below, and people can go deeper.
Glenn, you've been super generous with your time. Just one last question, if I could, and it's just triggered by what you said about referencing the pandemic. So if there's been one test of institutional competence, it has been this, and it seems to me a lot of institutions failed and failed miserably. So do you have a sense as to whether this actually will teach people the right lessons, and this will be a spur to institutional reform, or do you see things, especially getting normalized back to the sclerotic mediocrity that we had prior to COVID-19?
I think there's a reckoning coming, but whether it goes one direction or the other is a question. I think that the China model had some real successes, and I think there's a real attraction there, especially for a lot of the developing world. And I think the Taiwan model had many more and much greater successes. It's less known, and less known partly deliberately because of who doesn't want you to know about it. But I think it's a much more promising one, and I hope that's the lesson that we take instead.
Okay. So more pluralism, more digital democracy, right? And more concerted action, which I think are great lessons not only for institutional innovation at the societal level, but within our organizations as well. And maybe we close it there, Glenn, after this marathon discussion with you. We're so grateful that you shared all these amazing perspectives, and we'll keep following your progress at Social Exchange and beyond, right? Because we need more of these ideas and more applications of them. So thanks again so much.
Looking forward to working with both of you guys on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn.
Bye.